do have an answer to that in a minute, which is why I came to this hypothesis, because I was scratching my head about this same thing. So I'm going to really rush through this next stuff because we're short for time. Can we reverse it by going back? Can we, if we get people to eat a more ancestral style diet, can diabetes and other chronic obesity be reversed? These Australian Aborigines went back to the bush in the 80s, and essentially it pretty much normalized their blood glucose regulation, and they lost substantial amounts of weight. There are, of course, the early trials in Paleolithic style diet in Westerners, where people are encouraged to eat fruit, vegetables, unprocessed meats, nuts, fish, and of course eggs. And the foods that are excluded are all the processed foods, the cereal grains, flour and sugar, vegetable oils, and also beans and dairy products, and a lot of them, although a lot of people find that these hit weight much less hard. The current trials of the Paleolithic style diet are all small. They've got 10 to 30 participants, and they're fairly brief. So you'd think that you'd only find significant results if these effects were particularly large, and that's one of the encouraging things about them, that each of them do tend to find very strongly significant improvements despite the small groups, because this really is a big change that's coming about. Paleolithic diet versus Mediterranean diet, we've got the area under the curve after an oral glucose tolerance test. After 12 weeks of Paleolithic diet, we've got big improvements with Paleolithic and virtually untouched with the Mediterranean. This is the plotted out change in the area under the curve. Glucose is still on the way down at 12 weeks in the Paleolithic group. So if it had been a longer study, who knows where it may have ended up. And again, there's the greater waist loss. The ability of this way of eating to melt visceral fat is particularly encouraging because of the correlations between visceral fat and the bad stuff. This is a picture of a Mediterranean diet, and it's just kind of interesting that it looks very much like a Paleolithic diet, except it's got that bread sitting in there. So other benefits, the metabolic benefits are independent of reduced weight loss. So you can get metabolic improvements if you eat a calorically restricted diet of Twinkies. So it was important to establish that the changes that we're seeing here are not just because of the weight loss. But the other big effect that's seen in all studies where the intake is left unrestricted is that people spontaneously eat between 15 and 35% less. So there's a big satiety increase per calorie, and also the leptin levels, the fat reporter hormones, dropping by a large amount. Both of those best correlate with the absence of grains, brackets, excluding rice was the category they used. Latest paper that's out, this is a tough audience for any dietary trial. These are postmenopausal women who are at a BMI of over 27. And again, we see the usual, encouragingly, we see the usual improvements that are in the other trials. We've got sizable drops over, I think, 5 weeks? 5 weeks, 5% drop, 7.5% drop of waist. We've also got a reduction in resting heart rate, which is kind of interesting. Big changes in glucose, insulin, leptins dropped by 43%. Large drop in, well, it's halved hepatic lipid content, which is really good news because, of course, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease is something that travels with obesity. It's an old friend of mine as well, actually. And I had an anecdote here. I had about a month to go before they were going to biopsy my liver for fibrosis, and I just started eating paleo. So when I went back in to get the second blood test, thank God, they said, "You're all right, you can go." So in these women as well, despite it only being N of 10, they had a big decrease in hepatic lipid content. The media seem to portray the diet as all about being meat and based on what hunter-gatherers did, on what cavemen did and didn't. And I just want to underline the point that there's a lot of evidence out there based on living hunter-gatherers and clinical evidence now coming through in Westerners that indicate that this diet is a serious way forwards. And whatever vagueness is about evolutionary arguments that were made when the diet was originally being designed all those years ago, you shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It really seems to work, and it's worth investigating. It's also, I don't think for a second that this is being popular because it's a trendy fad. I think it's popular because people know when something works and they tell a friend. So how to explain this apparent fact that you can eat high carbohydrate, as long as it's sort of in root veg form or fruit, and have better weight outcomes and more sustainable weight outcomes than a lot of people seem to be able to achieve eating low carbohydrate diets. So, because I work in a GI unit, I got thinking about the GI microbiota. So, quick overview of the power of these little critters in our bellies. Mice that don't have any bacteria in their guts seem to be resistant to most models of diet-induced obesity. You can leave them with exposure to a cafeteria diet and they just don't seem to care much. The microbiota, it's known, is changed in just about any way you care to look in obese animals and humans. And if you transplant, by stool transplant, and this is mostly done in mice at the moment, from, say, an obese mouse or a mouse that was diet-induced obesity resistant or had been fed different food, and you transplant those into germ-free mice, you tend to change the mice start eating more, they put on weight or whatever. The outcome is the weight goes up in the recipient mouse. So it was actually transmissible by the gut bacteria. Also able to affect insulin levels. The insulin resistance goes up as well as leptin, and in mice with lots of with a normal lipopolysaccharide, the natural coat of the bacteria, you see a lot more infiltration of inflammatory cells into the fat tissue. However, this lipopolysaccharide coat may not be the prime driver of the appetite change, because in the bacteria with the neutered lipopolysaccharide, you still saw the same increases, and if anything, actually the insulin resistance and leptin uptake went worse. The different flavors of bacteria are also able to convey different phenotypes. If you feed mice high-fat chow, some of them will get obese, but some of them will get obese and also insulin-resistant and have the mouse equivalent of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. When you transplant those microbiota from each individual mouse into germ-free mice, keep feeding them high-fat chow, strongly sort of moves them in the direction of developing the phenotype that the donor had. So again, the bacteria would seem to be playing a strong role in the generation of these conditions. Another very recent bit of work that's been done, some of the changes you see in a gastric bypass operation seem again to be transmissible to germ-free mice when you swap over the bacteria. So the power of host-bacterial interactions may be really highly conserved, because it seems to work in fruit flies as well. These fruit flies were given a mutant bacteria that couldn't make acetic acid. The acetic acid itself didn't seem to improve the condition of the host, but the fruit flies with the mutant bacteria showed strongly altered insulin-like growth factor signaling, their developmental rate, remember I was mentioning about the kids getting taller, their body size, energy metabolism and intestinal stem cell activity went crazy. Over here, the circulating glucose and other sugars in the larvae and the triglycerides. And these were all normalizable by just giving a supplement of acetic acid, which, as I say, didn't affect the host on its own, so it made the bacteria revert to their normal behavior, and then the host's behavior went back to normal. Leptin itself seems to have been operating in pretty much the same form since our common ancestor with fruit flies. So this is a really conserved signaling hormone. Now, of course, most of the gastrointestinal bacteria are in the colon, but because the thing that really gets to the colon is fiber, but lots of trials of fiber don't seem to have ever produced the sort of metabolic improvements that would account for the differences between our Western health and hunter-gatherers. I'm sort of thinking more that it has to be the bacteria higher up in the gut that see the whole of the food, that can tell the difference. And of course, higher up, as well as seeing all of the food, that's where what they call the afferent vagus nerve, the nerves that communicate to the brain about what you've just eaten, what nutrients are in it, and that help determine the satiety a lot, and termination of meals and other decisions are taken under heavy influence of this vagus nerve. So looking at some of the changes that occur in rodent models, not all rats get fat when you give them high-fat chow. Some of them become diet-induced obese, and some of them are resistant to this. You see some changes in bacteria that are the same in both groups, but There are some others that obviously may be part of the problem, that occur only in the diet-induced obese group, but you also see, of course, an increase in the amount they eat. You see increased activation of some of the bacterial sensors that detect bits of bacteria, and you see inflammation occurring in the small bowel itself. So as the mice or rats start to eat more, you also see the level of the fat reporter hormone, leptin, goes up, and the nerves that project to the gut stop responding to leptin. The leptin resistance has affected the nerves that are important in satiety. And one of the main